Hi, and welcome to the Trust and Influence in B2B podcast. My name is Joel Harrison. I'm your host. Today we're going to talk about lead generation. And lead generation has long been a part of B2B marketing that nobody quite wants to look at too closely. At least that's my experience of it. For all the attention lavished on brand and content and account-based marketing, an enormous amount of B2B revenue still flows through lead generation. And historically, it's been one of the murkiest corners of the industry of the discipline. Some of the practices behind it have fallen well short of robust, let alone arguably ethical, with opaque data sources, intense signals that no one can really verify, leads of uncertain provenance and content and consent. And yet, money involved remains vast. In recent years, there's been a genuine push from some players to kind of, on the supply side, to kind of to clean up the way that this kind of discipline is handled, professionalise the way in which leads are sourced and traded. But not all the shonky practices have gone away. And the question which I have really is how much has really changed beneath the surface, and I guess also how bad was the problem in the first place. To talk about that today, my guest is Robin Caller, who's founder and CEO of Leadscale. Robin started the business back in 2001, so we discussed previously, just before I launched B2B Marketing Magazine, with the deliberately awkward ambition to deliver leads that are real people with consent that can actually be tracked, and a journey from lead to revenue that can be evidenced rather than assumed. 2 decades on, he's become one of the industry's more persistent voices for ethical standards in lead and demand generation, working with brands including BMW, Adobe, and DocuSign. If anyone who can tell us where trust really breaks down in this area and what to do about it, it's going to be him. So what are you going to learn from this episode? Well, we'll learn where trust actually breaks down in the lead gen supply chain and why the problem is structural, not just a handful of bad actors. What intent signals really represent and how to tell whether a lead's provenance can be traced. Why advertisers are often the victim of the problem and also part of the problem themselves. And the practical questions, more importantly, that every marketing leader or marketing manager should put into vendors and system lead suppliers, but probably aren't doing that right now. Remember, if you find this conversation valuable, we'd love you to subscribe or to like or to follow in whichever medium you consume this podcast, whether it's audio, video, or whatever platform. So please hit that button, wherever it might be. Give us a rating as well. It's very, really helpful to help us understand what's resonating to people and what they want to know about. So that's the preamble. Robin, welcome. Great to see you.
You too. Thanks for having me.
Well, we talked a while back about this topic, and it seemed like a really great thing to go and explore in detail. Robin, one of the reasons I invited you is because you're someone who's never shy of an opinion. So I wanted to try and give you a forum to get some of those opinions out on the table.
I think that's a gentle description of me, never shy of an opinion. I think other people may be a little bit firmer with that.
Well, this is a topic which I feel attracts or warrants firm opinions. And you know, when you're listening to this, you might not agree with what we get to, but this is the conversation we're going to have. So this is one perspective on this topic. Other opinions are available and are welcome too. But Robin, thank you for joining me today. I appreciate your time and looking forward to what we're going to talk about. And this is a passion topic for you, so it should make for hopefully a good conversation. So, Robin, let's get into it then. So, when we talk about trust and lead generation, what are we exactly talking about, and what's the most fundamental trust issue in this area that concerns you the most?
That's a good opening question. I think as an anecdote for you, when I got into lead and demand generation, which is something like 20 years ago now, Joel, I remember meeting somebody, a business leader from Google, at an event, and when I told him that I was getting involved in lead and demand generation, he described it as a dirty sector. And I think that's a difficult starting point to say 20 years ago it was deemed by other people in the space to be dirty, and you're asking, I think, fair questions 20 years later about trust in the space. The distrust stemmed from a period when personal data wasn't really being properly regulated at all. So it's pre-GDPR. If you think back to privacy regulations in 2006, 2010, or even before that, turn of the millennium, there was very little regard, I think, in the online advertising industry and amongst the entrepreneur brigade as to what are the legalities, what are the rights and wrongs of how you deal with personal information. Where is profiling acceptable or unacceptable? Where is technology, ad tech becoming snoop tech? I remember, and I'm sure you do, deep packet inspection and some of the other issues that dog display advertising. So the history of trust does go back to an era where there were, shall we say, few regulations or weak regulations, and then they were fairly poorly enforced. Now we live in an era where theoretically there are strong regulations, but it's questionable how well they're enforced. So that's the environment in which trust or distrust lives. Now, within that, to be brutal and specific and simplistic, one argument would be that a lack of transparency and visibility over the behavior or the activity that generates a record in the first place could lead to some question marks over the methodology, the apparatus, the workflow, or the process by which a record was generated, and consequently, not unreasonable to question whether it was generated at all or simply um, scraped. That seems to be a word that dominates AI, the AI era, scraped and submitted, in which case there should be no trust and no, think, consent involved, because a record was simply submitted as if you or I did something when we didn't do it. So that the market allows itself to be challenged, shall we say, by inquisitive minds like yours, through ultimately, I would say, some lack of transparency.
So that's a lot to unpack there. I think it's a great starting point. I guess I liked your point about now we're operating in a different world to what we were, in the noughties, which is, like I say, when I got interested involved with B2B marketing, and it was the Wild West compared to today in so many ways, wasn't it?
It
And
was.
GDPR, I mean, GDPR is one of those wonderful things where I remember the panic we had around it, and yet it does seem to have cleaned up at least a part of what B2B marketing is, and B, I don't think anyone would say that marketing is any worse because of it. If anything, is better because we actually have to be more robust and targeted in what we're doing.
It is.
Um,
I think it is better. That would be my summary as well, Joel. That it is better. Whether it's as good as one imagined it might be, because and that's my point. I think that regulations have to be strong in the first place, but then the enforcement also has to be strong for the full, I think, benefit of those regulations to be felt. But the presence of them has certainly made people more aware of the consequences, and brought to the surface, I think, disciplines like information security, privacy, compliance. So things are better than they were 20 plus years ago.
yeah, and I guess that there's probably, I mean, you and I talked about, we have a set of questions to go through, and you talk about whether we go off piece a little bit. I guess, um, you know, in parallel with that, you have seen an element of this lead generation space booming, but then also have been efforts of varying levels of effectiveness and genuine intent, in the pun, to make those things stick.
Yeah.
Well, here we are in a situation in 2026 where there's still bad practice going on, right? There is still,
Very
and it does seem like
bad.
it's like acknowledged by both sides, and yet no, neither side needs to be particularly that bothered about doing anything about it. They're happy with the deliberate ambiguity of that. Is that fair?
It is, and a certain unhealthy ambivalence as well, I think, Joel. So, if you break it down also, and I think you alluded to it earlier, if not on this conversation, the previous one, that all parties, I think, are somewhat responsible for the status that we find ourselves in. So on the sell side, it is possible that there are people on the sell side who are somewhat mischievous, right? On the buy side, it is equally plausible that there are people on the buy side who are equally mischievous. They just want to hit their targets, um, go home. And then also in the middle ground, no, we have also got a situation going on of a perfect storm for the big advertising agencies, right, where there's disintermediation of their capabilities from some of the largest players, the Google, Meta, LinkedIn, bringing capabilities that potentially disintermediate and cut out the agency practices, and there's pressures on them to maintain profitable businesses. So there's a reason for everybody on either side and in the middle to be a little bit, shall we say, mischievous in what they do. And I use that phrase, don't I, mischief, because I think what I've found over 20 years is that there is a tolerable level of mischief in our sector. There's also obviously an intolerable level.
It's funny. It's an interesting word, mischief, because one way to read that word, and I completely admit to being a pedant here, Robin, is a sense of fun and
Yeah.
playfulness. But
Well, there is some. I mean, if you make an unhealthy margin, then you can, of course, afford some fabulous jollies, as a, on on the basis of the margin you've made. And there is some fun in that. If you or I were invited on those jollies and we had a nice day out, we would be having fun. So I think because our industry is lovely, I mean, let's not take it away that sometimes we find ourselves at a breakfast or a lunch or a dinner with bright, interesting, optimistic people. Yeah, there's fun. We can't get away from that, I don't think, Joel.
Okay, but I guess it's not. So the fun in that is almost around gain rather than because it's all for laughs. It's all a big joke.
Sometimes I think it's taken too jovially. I think sometimes it is too much about fun and not business like enough. I mean, the antithesis would be outcomes. That all lead and demand generation was simply purchased, procured, and performed based on outcomes, and every decision made was outcome based, regardless of proximity, common interests, etc.
It's all about, as you say, it's about commercial objectives and outcomes. And is
Yeah.
this hitting my commercial targets rather than do I know that person? Am I bought into a way of working where I don't want to provide ultimate scrutiny about what I'm doing? That's what I'm taking from this.
I think so. But again,
Okay.
and just trying to be general and not point any fingers and just set the scene, that the mischief is on all parts. There are buy-side people who accept a tolerable level of mischief, even if you don't include it as fun. I mean, the fun's a nice interpretation. There's another one, which is fraud. And one of the reasons why I don't use the word fraud is that if an advertiser is willingly turning a blind eye to something, knowingly turning a blind eye to a practice or behavior, or I don't mean an advertiser because they're the legal fictions. That's the company, right? The brand. But the person at that brand, if they're willingly or knowingly turning a blind eye to something, then I don't believe that the intermediary or the supplier is actually obtaining any money by deceit. There's no deceit. So that's the problem with the word fraud. The fraud word suggests deceit. Fun suggests it's a bit of a jolly, but I think there's something in the middle, which is it has to perform, but within boundaries or parameters that are enough wiggle room, shall we say, to play.
You might describe it as nefarious pragmatism, but one of the words that you expressions that you use, we're going to get to our next question, was blind faith, and you're suggesting this is a kind of a I mean, you suggested in the past to me that this is industries operating a blind faith model, and this is where they this actually blind faith suggests to me that there's ignorance, they're just believing this will happen, whereas you're suggesting actually that in this conversation that everybody knows there's something not quite right, but they're just going along with it.
Yeah, I think that's I'm certainly of the older brigade. I can't say that everybody knows. I do think there'll be some people who genuinely don't realize what is going on, what is happening across the spectrum. But certainly anybody who's been in the space for a few years or more should be aware that there is a range of behavior. And let's try and scope that out, if I may, because the blind versus transparent, the most transparent place that an advertiser can collect a lead or an inquiry is on their own website. Because that is a domain that they control, and they can put all of the necessary tools, consents, permissions, practices, capture forms, you name it, fields, everything's there to allow that advertiser to be absolutely certain that events happened, that the content or the content that needed to be present was present, that the individual behavior on the page at the time was true, and that the captured information was genuine and accurate. They can then try and work very clearly to understand the level of intent or the level of engagement behind the inquiry and the individual. So that's the most transparent place. And the second most transparent place after your own domain, the next tier, if you like, are the major global platforms where you can fully see what happened and you get a report of exactly what happened. And where I'm thinking of a lead ad unit on LinkedIn or a native capture form on Meta, you can see exactly what happened and where. And I'd add Amazon lead ads to that capability set. So that's an obvious global major platform, and I think everything's safe there. The third area that brings in the question of blindness is when you go further out and you move into the third party space beyond your first party domain or second party platforms. If you go to third party, and the blind point being, and you don't even know who they are because you've gone through an intermediary to place your advertising on those domains, then you have gone blind. And if you've gone blind and you trust the industry to do the right thing all the time, that's your faith. So you've got blindness and you've got trust and faith. So that's the blind faith argument. It doesn't really, and I just wanted to be certain about this, doesn't apply to your own domain, and it doesn't apply to the transparent, obvious major platforms where you can see exactly what's happening. You control the fields, the terms, the conditions, and you can be much more certain of the veracity or the truth of the event and the individual behind the event.
So we have the two poles. We have your own media, your own forms, your own website, your own content, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And then we have the major ad networks who are shareholders, and all kinds of scrutiny that gets applied to them. And then there's this large grey space in the middle. I'm assuming that there are shades of grey within that, right? I suspect there are some actors that are behaving very well in the middle, and there's some actors that are behaving very badly. Is that fair?
I think that's fair. And I think that the evidence, if you want to, and we may be jumping ahead to a question you haven't asked yet, but if you want to measure for yourself I suppose the trust that you could have in a partner, it would probably be commensurate with the level of transparency they shared with you about their processes, their methodology, their apparatus. I think it is, by the way, one step too far for an advertiser to insist that they put code on a third party's webpage. I think, unfortunately, what happens there is the advertiser's overstepping. They'll pick up metadata and other information that they haven't a right to access or a reason to purchase or procure. But if everything is shown, and I'm thinking, really, if you want an example, Joel, of a website like Top Gear, a global super brand in automotive, where you can see exactly what capture forms exist, where they are on exactly what domain, not just at the domain level, but down to the URL. And you can see the privacy policies and the terms and conditions, and that a capture form is empty rather than being pre-populated or pre-ticked, or no boxes are ticked before an individual comes along. That engenders trust, but it's not blind anymore. It's the transparency that brings the trust.
So transparency equals trust, which is, is a good kind of way of operating in life. There's the transparency about what the process they're going to go through, the process from both sides, from the buyer, from the kind of form filler's side, and the buyer of that information side, and then also obviously the operator of that. I guess there's the transparency of reporting as well, presumably as well, which is part of that. So rather than just go, here you go, here's an email address, presumably you want to give someone much more information than that about where, when, what, et cetera, et cetera.
That's right. That's right. So that the unit that's transacted in lead and demand generation is never, in my experience these days, is never just the personal information that was supplied on the form. It has to go beyond that. It has to be more information, timestamps, URLs, other metadata that allows greater truth test over the data that is being traded. None of which I'm buying. All I was buying from you was the complete lead. But I'm going to understand enough about your business now that I could haggle with you perhaps over price, volume later. So that's where the sensitivity is more commercial sensitivity, I think.
Okay. That's a very...
That I think, so when you explore that, just to round that one off for you, when you explore the solutions, they have to be fair and reasonable to at least three parties, the seller, the buyer, but the data subject as well. And I think many solutions fail that test. They don't pass does this work for all three parties involved? Capturer / seller, capturer / buyer, and data subject form filler.
One of your more interesting observations is that the advertiser is often both the victim and part of the problem, which is kind of fascinating, isn't it, really? I mean, presumably, it's part of the issue that they're not sharing enough of the outcomes on the data with their agencies and suppliers, and it would more transparency be part of make a better situation?
Yes, I think that is a very important point to bring up. I think that transparency isn't simply and solely the responsibility on the sell side of the market. over the last few years, I would say that some of the more advanced advertisers are being more transparent themselves. What we've seen is advertisers inside their own organizations. There's been a drive for an alignment between sales and marketing. There's been a drive for information to flow across departments in a more fluent and fluid and joined up way. And I'm concerned and hopeful at the same time that that journey doesn't stop inside the advertising organization. If the advertiser shares the performance and the outcomes of data with their agencies or with their supplier partners, then those partners can look at what is actually working. They can actually just look at value-based outcomes, and they would disassociate from the sources and the suppliers of data that wasn't performing for them. And I think that there will be a correlation between mischief or mistrust and performance of data. I think that if a data subject is genuinely interested in an advertiser's goods or services, the advertiser will get some engagement and value from that. And if the data subject is not really interested, if there's been some kind of nefarious practice going on, then ultimately the advertiser will get a lesser performance from that delta of data. I don't want to say that it will be a one-to-one relationship. I accept that there could be some leads that are not entirely true or not generated entirely as intended that do perform. But I think over time, there will be a correlation between performance, value, and source. And so it is important that the transparency is both ways. And just to reiterate on that and then illustrate that a little bit further, we have clients who get unsubscribes within 5 to 10 days of purchasing a lead. Now, they should ask for a free replacement. There's no fault or flaw potentially in the supplier delivering that record. People can change their minds. They could unsubscribe because the welcome cycle is poor, or they've just made a different purchase decision and decided to clean up their inbox. Nevertheless, that record is now very valueless, much more valueless to the advertiser, and free replacements would help improve the performance of the program, which would increase investment in the space, right? And a better flow of money between advertiser and supplier. That's one example. Another example would therefore be on the other side, clicks and engagements and conversations and potential deal visibility. That information is crucial because that would allow a supplier to actually optimize towards the behaviors or the activities on the supply side that generated the better value for the advertiser. And so an advertiser could obviously have a different relationship of trust with a supplier where they trust the supplier to proactively do the right thing for the advertiser. But for that, there has to be a better journey of data. The journey of data, the composition of the journey of data has to be two-way, joined up, and also in real time.
So you're describing a system with multiple potential points of failure.
Yeah.
And a lack of willingness or aptitude on the part of the parties involved to address those failures.
100%.
So, but
and then just to allude to what you said at the top of the conversation. So I'm 58 and I rock up into a meeting with people who are now predominantly a lot younger than me. I don't know how it happened, Joel, but I suddenly went from being the youngest guy to the oldest guy in the room. And I'm at least able now to say all of these things without being accused of being, youthfully arrogant, but I'm not still necessarily appreciated for bringing it up because it's a problem and somebody has to work at solving a problem. They'd rather perhaps turn a blind eye.
But so that's helpful. Thank you. I guess where I'm getting at is in an era where marketing and marketers, I'm talking about those working for the client brands in this, right? Not the agencies, not the lead gen service providers, are under pressure as never before, and budgets and there should be theoretically an impetus to resolve this, and yet there's not always one. An anecdote that dropped to me last week is just around the whole, and this plays back to the kind of veracity or the challenge with MQLs, right? Is I've got a lead generation target to hit, and I've been mandated to deliver 100/1,000 leads a quarter, and the salesman knows that not all of them will be very good. And I know they're all very good as long as it's plausible deniability is an expression that was used to me by a good friend and colleague. That I can just say, not my problem, Gov. I did everything in good faith, knowing that I actually didn't. Here's your leads, and goodbye on to the next quarter.
Yeah.
Is that a fair representation of what's going on in some cases?
Yes, it is. And actually, when you said plausible deniability, I would go a little bit further. I actually think there's also sometimes a procurement process, a chain of purchase using sometimes the big names in the sector, because there's more plausible deniability if you go to a big name reputable shop that they must be doing it right. I mean, they've been around for 100 years, right? They wouldn't dare damage their brand reputation by doing anything mischievous or wrong, and they must have it all buttoned down. That's the blind faith piece of these guys are the pros. They must have it buttoned down. So I think yes, that is very fair. And again, to your point, that these are also individuals in their defense. There's a lot of individuals under pressure on all sides: salespeople to hit target, agency people to get the business delivered in the time frame, and maybe underpaid or feeling rewarded or overworked, right? Or they actually have to fill out their hours as being FTEs for more than 40 hours a week, but only work 40 hours a week. I don't want to say that's happening because I don't know if it's happening or not, but I can imagine that there are times and places where the pressure could be on. And to your point, finally, the advertiser the marketer has a target to hit.
What this says to me though is it just plays back to the inherent problem with the MQL mindset, right, as a business model.
Yeah.
And this is something which has been, and I had John Miller on the podcast recently, who, the founder of Marketo, and was the guy responsible for
it's all
a lot of this behavior. And yeah, he rejects the MQLs as a mindset, as a operating model. And yet here we are 20 years on from the creation of those platforms. Is this the crux of the problem?
I do reject that. I think any it's nice to have a simplistic solution. And it's also I think this is quite an interesting point. Sometimes the solution is just not simple. Whether you want a simple solution or not, it might be simple to explain. I might have a simple way of communicating it to you, but that doesn't make it simple. Sometimes people want simple above good, right? And I think that's part of the crux of it. To the point of an MQL, I'm probably aligned with John, and I don't believe in it insofar as it's intellectually, for me, it's a DQL at best. It's dynamic. It's changing. You qualify, whatever your qualification is, it's changing over time, and it's changing based upon cost factors, other pressures, competitive tensions, alternative propositions. So to say I have touched the record 6 times and therefore it is sales ready seems a bit oversimplistic and static. And that's why I like the idea of a dynamically qualified record. It's changing all the time as this signal intelligence and real-time nature of digital is brought, or the power is brought to bear. Then an individual or an account-based team, their status is changing over time.
So what you seem to be advocating for is a more nuanced way of operating. It's not just pass the baton between different functions. It's about actually understanding intent over a broader spectrum.
Yes, and the technology has advanced and we're capable of delivering it. But that means adoption. That means people rolling up their sleeves, understanding how it works, specifying it, changing purchase terms and conditions, perhaps pricing models. And it has its challenges to deliver when things are dynamic. It's not as easy to buy dynamically priced goods as it is to buy statically priced goods, right? I'll have 100 for £10 each. I can do that math. That's 10,000. If you tell me the price is changing all the time, well, how many will I get?
So we're stuck in an imperfect system because it's something which accountants can. I'm not being trying to be pejorative in that, but accountants can work with that. It's a finite amount on the budget, and I know I put X in it and I get Y out, and I give Y to the sales team. Therefore, everyone is happy in a understandable, highly imperfect system.
Yeah, and going back to the top question about trust in the space, then there has to be some trust because everybody understands it to be imperfect, and that's where I come up with my language of tolerance, right? That there is a tolerance because of the imperfection. So now it's about managing tolerances and making sure that the tolerances on the sell side are are maintainable, that I can still make a profit on the sell side. The tolerance is on the buy side. I can still turn the data into more money than I purchased it for. So it's within my capability. And for the traders in the middle, they can, shall we say, keep their slice, keep their percentage points in the dollar, while bringing both sides together and add value, hopefully, through delivering continuous enhancement and improvement towards perfection. That's
So
obviously that vision statement.
I like the vision you're presenting there. I guess is this a situation which is going to get resolved? Because it seems like, or are we're gonna be floundering on in some similar level of suboptimalness, whereby the person, it feels to me like somebody needs to grasp the situation, shake it, and go, let's work this out that we're better. But the market, for different reasons, the people in the brand marketing team aren't willing or able to do this, and part of it is about expertise and about time, and others about the financial model you're working in. So it's going to carry on as it is. Is that a depressingly likely scenario? Do you agree with that hypothesis?
I think it depends on my mood, whether I agree with you about that. I think there are times when it is a depressingly likely outcome. There are other times when I remain, furiously ambitious in the sense of wishing to deliver some of the solutions I know that exist. I mean, just to give you, again, to touch on one example that I think is interesting, the science and the technology that is available to provide what's described as zero knowledge proof, that is available today. I think, to your point, that the concern or the negative outcome is if the people involved are unwilling to learn about zero knowledge proof solutions, unwilling or disinterested in championing their implementation, and then a status quo that has more intolerance within it exists. And Joel, what I would add to that, I mean, I'll speak for myself. I was going to say we're knocking on, but I do have some, again, at an individual level, with some empathy now and sympathy, right? We're watching people lose their jobs at times, and I think that is a sad consequence of not solving problems that could have been solved, and the inefficiencies that have existed have been allowed to persist, and then the economic viability of certain activities has just been proven sustainable. So that I think is a sad argument for these solutions actually coming. Somebody, if they wish to, it sounds simplistic again, but if they wish to keep their job and rise to the top, then they have to champion tackling these challenges and delivering the solutions. And technologically, the solutions are available. Look, I'm not pitching Leadscale specifically today. Leadscale, a privately held and profitable, small North London, Islington-based business, has many solutions. We, to your point, supplying them to some of the biggest brands in the world, but we're not doing a great job, right?
And as you say, I'm sure you guys do a brilliant job, and there are other solutions available. So there are solutions to these challenges available. But I guess the key question I want to kind of draw this conversation to a conclusion on is that, assuming that you're a marketing leader or a marketing decision maker, at least within a B2B organization, and you are involved in lead generation in some capacity, or source or purchasing leads, what questions, and even if you haven't got the knowledge of this challenge inherently, which you have, Robin, having worked in this every day for over 20 years, what are the questions which you should be asking now to try and improve what it is that you're doing in the short term, without necessarily having the confidence to go and rip apart the whole system, break again? What 2 or 3 questions should you ask to be better and to get a better result right now?
The first and most obvious is that you immediately stop purchasing data from anybody who cannot evidence to you exactly where they got it from, when they got it, and how they got it. Try not to buy from what I describe as blind, blended brokers. That's within your capability set today. Simply stop working with any organization that is blending data from sources they don't disclose, so that you don't know what came from where. I don't think you need to ask questions for that. I think you just need to impose some reasonable and actually law abiding practices. Because there's no way under the European regulations, at least, that you can meet your obligations as an instigator and an advertiser, that you have done due diligence over the sources and the suppliers if you don't know who they are. So now let's assume that you're only dealing with people who are, at their simplest, manufacturing and supplying you data, or acquiring and supplying you data, but they are the controller and the supplier of record. So the questions would be, where or how do you manufacture or acquire your data from? Okay. And I'd like you to ensure that when you supply it to me, that it is always labeled as manufactured or acquired. And if it is acquired, where from? Were you willing to label it? And if it's manufactured, are you willing to label that accurately and truthfully as well? That would at least bring some transparency on that side of the
Okay.
mark. So I think the questions there are telling. I think the other question that I would ask any supplier, if I really wanted to get down to the nitty gritty, is, look, I appreciate that you should not or could not put my pixel on your page, Joel. That would be a step too far, where I see more of your trade secrets than I need to see for the proof that I require. But are you willing to implement a zero knowledge proof solution, an intermediary, a trusted intermediary, to sit between us, who could certify and validate and verify? We talked a little bit about provenance, the provenance of the data, to my satisfaction. Are you willing to work with a third party that will ensure I get what I need for my transparency and comfort, without you disclosing or giving up any trade secrets? And if they say yes to that, then I think they're the businesses to do business with, right? I think that you could go to Top Gear, or you could go to Marketing Week, right? Or you could go to Forbes, and you could probably prosecute a much more trustworthy relationship. You don't have that problem with your own domain because you're buying
Yep.
clicks, you're arbitraging from click to lead.
Right.
You don't have that problem with the major platforms because you can see that already.
Okay. And so just to reiterate, the reason to do all of this is because you believe this is actually, if you don't do this, the quality you're going to get will be much worse, and consequently your marketing effectively worse. So it's not just about ethics because it's the right thing or because it's abandoning shonky behavior. It's about ultimately the marketers getting a better result for a better bang for their buck.
Yeah, and I would soften that a bit, though. My caveat would be that there will still be some suppliers who are not willing to do all of that, but
Yeah.
you get a good enough bang for your buck that it's commercially viable. That leaves you with another question, which is, what's my appetite to risk? What's my exposure here? Am I okay with the regulatory risk that might be involved?
Okay.
And if I am, happy days.
So closing question then, Robin, because this is a conversation you and I could carry on for a long time because it's fascinating.
Well, I'm more than happy to do it with you again at some point. It's going to be I think it's, by the way, going to be a very interesting 6 to 12 months, because the market is very tense and tough at the moment. There is new technology arriving all the time that's threatening to upend some of the players. And it's going to be an interesting period.
Well, that'll be interesting to see how that plays out. What do you think? Do you think lead generation becomes more transparent and trustworthy? Are we heading to an even more complex world where AI, automation, and synthetic activity make it even harder to have trust in these players and trust in your leads that comes in?
I think there's certainly a danger of that, Joel. Yes. So it's a great question. I think that either future vision are possible. I think that the challenge for the good practitioners then on the sell side will be to, how do they set themselves apart and evidence that they are not part of that, I think that terrible, synthetic, fabricated, fraudulent vision. So that's a challenge anyway. If you believe that that's possible, what tactics and activities and technology you're going to put in place to evidence and demonstrate you are a good guy? I think that's an interesting thought. I have I suppose it's partially it's a terrible hope, but I think one of the single biggest things that could change the next few years would be if a major global advertiser actually got properly investigated and penalized for their mischief, because I think that's one of the things that hasn't happened at a regulatory level, and it's allowing for all of the scenarios that you're alluding
Yeah.
to fester. Because I think that the moment the advertiser fraternity genuinely believes that 4% of their world turnover is at jeopardy if they are found to be guilty of turning a blind eye or blind faith or tolerance of too great a level of mischief, then the sector will have to
Yeah.
adapt and adjust. My final point on it, I think, is though I think my ultimate answer or my optimistic answer would be no. I don't think that synthetic, fabricated, fake, and fraud will survive, because I think that the future of lead and demand generation is value driven, and think that interestingly, LLMs and answer engines are going to be the precursor to a renaissance of the trusted partner in publishing, that there's going to be different transactions, not just the lead transaction, but actually content and relationships will be partnerships instead of just transactional, 1,000 leads for £1,000. And that will change the landscape. And perhaps in simple terms, more leads will not be the answer. Better value, more transparent, partner generated will be the answer. And if that emerges, then no, the horrible synthetic cheating landscape won't be able to emerge.
Fantastic, Robin. That's all we've got time for today. Great positive point to end it on there. Really, really like the positivity going forward after a conversation that was inherently
an optimist, Joel.
well, but inherently the conversation is quite cynical. I've been taking you to some dark places with this, so I appreciate ending with a positive note.
I thought put the dark background on for you for the
Absolutely. As me and the voice of life, you can see Robin is sat in a black studio. It's like something out of the Death Star, but it looks very it's very cool looking. So, Robin, thanks for my guest today. I really enjoyed talking to you. It's a rich topic, one which we will, as you say, will evolve and no doubt will return to. So, I really thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate you making the time. Thanks for talking with me, Joel.
Well, that's great. That's all from us today. If you've enjoyed this conversation, you found this interesting, trust is a multifaceted challenge in B2B marketing right now. We'd love you to subscribe, to like, or to follow wherever you consume your podcasts. So don't forget to tune in very soon. More fascinating conversations coming like this on this topic very soon. But from me, for now, goodbye and thanks for listening.